This is a blueprint that, when implemented, it will establish that those wonderful, dear lives that were taken on April 18th and 19th would not have been taken in vain. Those lives cannot have been taken in vain. That cannot happen.
And welcome back. I'm Sheldon McLeod. This is Thinking Out Loud here on the Saltwire Network, and I will give full props to the entire Saltwire team. It was a huge day yesterday, a lot to take in with the Mass Casualty Commission releasing its report, close to 3,000 pages, stories online that you can read about the family saying they're not going to back down, the folks on Hunter Road and their perspective, a blunt assessment of the RCMP failures and the intimate partner violence that was accentuated in that report, and, you know, the whole issue about the public alert being now up for discussion. Wayne McKay is a professor emeritus at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University, and he and I have spoken often about this over the last several years. Wayne McKay, thank you very much for joining the conversation again. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
What was your immediate thoughts yesterday as the 3,000 pages were revealed, the multi-volume report from the Mass Casualty Commission?
I guess my first thought was that the commissioners had really outperformed themselves, that it was a very extensive and impressive report, 3,000 pages, lots of detail, obviously, and that it was very to the point, hard-hitting, and with some excellent recommendations. That's my sort of first general thought.
Now, I spoke with a lawyer yesterday, and this is an inquiry, but these are recommendations, 130 recommendations. There's nothing in law that would say any government has to follow up on any recommendation or any institution. From my perspective, what's yours?
No, absolutely. They are recommendations. They don't have any legal force in their current state. And really the key thing in converting them into implemented action is political pressure. It's not really a legal thing. There are recommendations. I think given the profile of this report and the degree of political pressure, I think a lot will be implemented, but I think we'll probably talk about that in the course of this discussion.
Absolutely. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, he was at the release, so was the Premier of Nova Scotia. But we'd had a government change. The Premier who announced the inquiry in Nova Scotia and his minister, neither of whom are in government or in politics anymore. And even on the federal level, the ministers have changed. I guess in a roundabout way, I'm asking what, as a change in political, the political players, how does that influence or affect implementation of recommendations?
Well, I think it greatly increases the chance of implementation. And you could add to that list, of course, the Chief Commissioner of the RCMP and others also gone. So I think it does increase the chances of the implementation. And realistically, I think it's a timing point. I know a lot of people have been saying this, but I think it is a point in time that is different from some of the earlier inquiries, such as the Bastarash one into the RCMP in 2020 or the one out of the Moncton Police in 2014. I think it would be a real insult to the tragic deaths of these people if there wasn't very serious action. And I think there will be. I think there will be really significant change emerge from this report. And I congratulate the commissioners and their staff for doing that.
So moving forward, implementing some of these recommendations, that was a very blunt criticism of the RCMP, but many of the senior leadership have retired or were promoted. And I'd ask Commissioner Fitch, how do you hold people to account who are no longer in those positions? What's your thought?
Well, it's a really important question, and they were very clear and blunt about that. And a lot of people felt, when you looked at it, that some of the frontline responders were doing the best they could, but the command structure left a lot to be desired. And so I think that I certainly agree with what the commission had to say. In terms of those who have left or been promoted, it seems to me that at least at a political level, again, there has to be a serious analysis. You can't have a transformational systemic change in the system and in the RCMP, for example, without changing some key personnel. So for those that were promoted, I don't know where that suggests they should go. And as to liability and so on for others, that's kind of for the lawyers and others to look into, I guess. But the fact that they've currently left the position doesn't necessarily change any possible arguments one way or the other about liability, I think.
And we talked about class action lawsuits and that civil, the civil outcome that's yet to be decided or determined. What, if anything, in this report helps the case, the law firms that are bringing those forward on behalf of the families?
Well, in spite of the fact that there are, of course, rules about using evidence from an inquiry like this in an actual civil action or in a court action, in spite of that, I think there's quite a bit here that would be quite helpful to the people claiming liability arising out of all of this. And in fact, I can not really think of another commission study that was so direct and condemning in terms of the actions of the police in this particular and others, but the RCMP and police generally in this. So I think that can do nothing but help the case for those making civil claims against various parties like the RCMP.
There was much said about the intimate partner violence and gender-based violence, and that was another one of those lenses that this commission viewed this through, and making a recommendation, turning it on its head, saying community policing should be community first, policing second. It should be the community who decides what police do, not the other way around. And I'm wondering what that says to you, given the nature of what we just went through and some of the long-standing criticisms of over the RCMP and the way that they work as a provincial policing service.
Well, I think that's a really important part of the report, and in part of its potential transformative nature, because it doesn't just focus on the police as the key agency for promoting safety. It says they have to work collaboratively with other policing agencies, with other agencies to achieve that, and that the community input is critical. I mean, it's interesting, not that they did this, but the three critical volumes, violence, community, and policing, communities in the middle, even before policing. And I think there is some message of that. And I think Commissioner Fitch in her discussion with you the other day sort of made that point as well. Part of the shift is recognizing the police have a role to play, which needs to be clearly defined, but they're not the only players. And there's other really important players, and they have to be accountable to the community. And that seems to be a major failing over the years with the RCMP, at least recently. Bad communication, not giving all the evidence, all those kind of things have to change.
Revisiting the issue of public alerts, it was shocking in some ways to say that there were senior members of the RCMP leadership in Nova Scotia who didn't even know that tool was available to them at that very critical time that this commission says it would have helped save lives.
Well, I think that's one of the really sad but true things that emerge from this commission, is that it may well be that some of these failures did lead, as the family said, to the loss of lives on April 19th that might not have happened otherwise, and that it happened in part because the people concerned didn't have the knowledge, it didn't have the ability to use tools that were there. So yes, there's some tools that they probably need that they didn't have, but some of them they actually did have, but they weren't prepared to use them or didn't know how to use them. And that is a very serious concern, obviously, and one that needs to be addressed.
And that does align with that original argument or statement that, well, what do we say? Do we tell people it's a person dressed as a police officer that's going to cause mass panic? This commission completely doused cold water on that, saying people are responsible enough to protect themselves and their community, and it would not have, that the rest of that are just fallacies. And I think that was an important lesson that was somewhat buried. I mean, it's hard not to bury anything in 3,000 pages of document.
No, I completely agree with you, and I noticed that as well. I think they said myths and misconceptions about that, and completely rejected that explanation, as much of the public did. They perhaps stopped a little short of saying very self-serving, that, obviously we don't want police officers being shot. First of all, that's not likely to happen. But secondly, are you saying that's more significant than other people dying? I mean, they weren't saying that directly, but that may have been some of the implications of that. So I think it's a good illustration of how hard-hitting and difficult truths were revealed by the commission report.
Looking at revisiting the idea of them as a provincial police force in Nova Scotia, I think I read there's a current agreement in place till 2032. That's a long horizon. That's a ways away from today. Legally, is there any way the province could cancel that contract or interrupt that agreement?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I don't know that as an area of my expertise, but I would think in this circumstance, if you could ever make a case for significant change of circumstance, this would be it. You have a highly credible, highly expensive, and highly impressive commission saying that this model is failing and we need to have a reconsideration of the whole model of contract policing and how you do it. Surely that's a kind of intervening event that may make the existing contract changeable. And as a matter of sort of contract law, I don't know what that holds, but as a matter of public policy, that makes total sense. If in fact, as the commission states, we have a very bad and somewhat dangerous system, surely we don't have to wait till 2032 to change that system. Just doesn't make sense to say that, does it?
You and I had spoken about a crisis in confidence that this commission was moving through, and there were many people who were critical. There were family members who walked out. And in speaking with some of my colleagues, it sounds like many of those family members were very pleasant. That's the wrong way to put it. They were surprised to see that this was a blunt assessment and that there were criticism, very pointed criticism towards the RCMP. Did this, in your mind, redeem some of that, or alleviate some of that concern? Has it worked out to the benefit of all of us that, we went through that process, even though people were going to doubt whether or not it's going to make a difference?
I think that it did. And it's really important to make that point, that I think the commission had some process problems along the way. It's a big, complex thing. That's not surprising, to the point, as we talked about, that several people felt the trust was no longer there. But I think the report redeemed them, in my opinion, that the report so clearly addresses the critical issues and so bluntly addresses the critical issues that even among its biggest critics, and I was a smaller critic, but I was one of them, and many others were of certain parts, and the families quite rightly, many points were. But I think, as you're saying, now people are saying they came through. They didn't pull their punches. They called it like they saw it, and they're making important recommendations for changing the whole system, not just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. So I think the commission's doubters have been somewhat set aside, and more power to the commission. I congratulate them.
And we had talked about the the former Chief Justice, the man who headed this commission, and his reputation. And I thought it was a good choice in the beginning, and that's proven to be true at the end.
Absolutely. I mean, I always had a lot and have a great deal of confidence in Michael McDonald and his record and his performance, and he's delivered again. And in fact, this may be one of his crowning achievements of his career, for which he may well be most remembered. I mean, there's a lot of things to pick from there, but this would be a big one. And I think, at this point, it's easy to be optimistic. We still have the big issues of implementing, but in terms of the performance of the commission itself, I think they've really outdone themselves.
And now comes the heavy lifting. But I think when the Commissioner McDonald said the deaths of these people cannot be in vain, it really did highlight the fact that they took this very seriously and did not pull any punches whatsoever when they were talking about the way the RCMP handled this case.
Well, not only did he say that in a very effective way in the press conference, but it was clear that it was sincere. And I think that's really an important message for all Canadians and Nova Scotians, that it would be somewhat of an insult to this tragic loss of lives and to the families and the people themselves if we don't act on these recommendations and make some significant changes to change the pattern for the future. And why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we try to make a safer society? And why wouldn't Canada try to set itself up as a model of what to do? And I think the commission's kind of given us a blueprint for that. And now it's up to us to deliver on that.
Wayne McKay, any final thoughts on this process, the fact that we're coming up on the third anniversary of that weekend?
Well, the only thing I would add, which is perhaps I shouldn't, that was all optimism. I'll add a small a note of pessimism. I was disappointed in the comments, the first comments from the top RCMP officer in Nova Scotia and the chief commissioner, that they didn't start off by admitting their mistakes as the commission recommended, but rather still were somewhat defending their performance. And I understand why you wouldn't have time to digest all of these recommendations, but these are really important. And I hope that's not at all typical of the response from the RCMP going forward. So in a very positive picture where I have great hope, that caused me a bit of pause, that I thought that was not as well handled as it should have been.
And just to put a dot on the end of that, they did issue a news release last night in which they did say they were sorry. So perhaps some of that concern or criticism landed on someone's desk and someone took that to heart.
Well, that's encouraging and adds to the positive note.
Wayne McKay, Professor Emeritus at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. As always, thank you, sir.
Always a pleasure. Thanks.